The bullet finds him on the seventh run. Thomas Bennett feels it, a punch of hot metal through his abdomen, but his hands don't stop moving. They're already reaching for the morphine syrette in his medic bag. Not for himself. For Private Eddie Slovik Jr., who lies 15 yards ahead, screaming into the Philippine mud. The Japanese machine gun that just shot Bennett adjusts its angle, searching. Tracer rounds draw orange lines through the smoke 2 feet above his head. He crawls forward anyway. This is February 9th, 1945. The place is a nameless rice paddy near Baguio, Luzon. The space between Bennett and that machine gun nest is 75 yards of absolute certainty. Cross it, and you die. Bennett has already crossed it 12 times, 6 times out, 6 times back, dragging wounded men to safety, while bullets turned the air into a storm of lead. His commanding officer ordered him to stop after the second rescue. His fellow medics begged him to stop after the fourth. The Japanese gunners, somewhere in the tree line, invisible, methodical, have been trying to stop him since the first. They finally succeed on run number 7. But Thomas Bennett, 23 years old, a corporal who refuses to carry a weapon, who volunteered for the most dangerous job in the most dangerous war, doesn't stop crawling. Because stopping would mean Private Slovik dies alone. And that's not something Thomas Bennett's God allows. This is the story of a man who ran toward death 7 times because his conscience wouldn't let him run away once. It's about what happens when absolute conviction meets absolute chaos. It's about the moment faith stops being a word you say in church and becomes a decision you make in hell. The war started for Thomas Jerome Bennett on December 7, 1941, but his decision about it began 16 years earlier in a small white church in Morgantown, West Virginia. He was 7 when his mother took his hand and led him down the aisle for baptism. The water was cold. The preacher's voice echoed off pine rafters. And somewhere in that moment, Margaret Bennett would later tell anyone who asked, something settled into her son that would never leave. He emerged from that baptismal font with a stillness about him, a clarity that made him seem older than he was. Thou shalt not kill. For most people, it's scripture. For Thomas Bennett, it became blueprint. He grew up quiet in a loud world. Morgantown in the 1930s was coal dust and hard men, union fights and depression desperation. Boys learned to make fists before they learned to read. Thomas learned neither. He was small for his age, gentle in a way that invited bullying. He took the beatings, never threw a punch back. His brother Robert, 2 years older, 2 inches taller, infinitely more willing to fight, would arrive afterward to finish what Thomas wouldn't start. "Why don't you defend yourself?" Robert asked once after pulling Thomas from a tangle of bodies behind the school. Thomas touched his split lip, tasted copper. Defending yourself and hurting someone else, they're the same thing. That's stupid. Maybe. But it wasn't stupid. It was theological. It was the product of a boy who read his Bible like other boys read adventure serials, who took love thy enemy, not as metaphor, but as mandate. His friends at Bethany Church of the Brethren reinforced it. The Church of the Brethren, one of America's historic peace churches, along with Quakers and Mennonites, preached radical pacifism. Not the passive kind, the active kind. The kind that required more courage than fighting because it meant taking punishment without returning it. When Thomas turned 18 in 1939, Europe was already burning. When he turned 20 in 1941, Pearl Harbor burned too. The radio in the Bennett kitchen crackled with Roosevelt's voice. A date which will live in infamy. Robert enlisted the next morning. So did half the boys from Thomas's high school. Thomas didn't. "You scared?" someone asked at the local diner. "No," Thomas said, and he wasn't. Fear would have been easier to explain. Fear everyone understood. Conviction, the kind that made you more afraid of violating your principles than dying, that was harder. The Selective Service and Training Act of 1940 included provisions for conscientious objectors. If you could prove sincere religious opposition to war, you could be assigned to non-combatant service. Thomas registered as a CO. He filled out Form 47, the Special Conscientious Objector Classification Form. Under religious training and belief, he wrote 3 pages in careful block letters explaining why Jesus' commandment to love enemies wasn't negotiable, even when those enemies were firing at you. His draft board, 5 men in their 50s, all veterans of the previous war, read it in silence. "Son," the chairman finally said, "you understand what you're saying here? You're saying even if someone's trying to kill you, you won't shoot back?" "Yes, sir." "Even if they're trying to kill your friends?" "Yes, sir." "Even if they're Nazis? Japs?" Thomas met his eyes. "Especially then. That's when it matters most. The board classified him 1AO, available for non-combatant military service only. He would serve. He would wear the uniform. He would face the same dangers. He just wouldn't carry a gun." His father, a coal miner with black lung and no patience for philosophy, didn't speak to him for 3 months. Old men at the church called him coward to his face. Someone painted yellow on the Bennett family's front door. Robert, already in infantry training at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, wrote exactly 1 letter. "You're breaking Mom's heart. Man up." Thomas kept the letter. Never responded. What could he say? That he was more afraid of becoming a killer than being called a coward? That he'd rather die with a clean conscience than live with blood on his hands? In June 1943, Thomas Bennett reported to Camp Lee, Virginia, for basic training. They issued him everything a soldier received: helmet, boots, pack, canteen, entrenching tool, except a rifle. Instead, they gave him a medic bag: morphine, sulfa powder, bandages, tourniquets, tools for saving lives. The other recruits didn't know what to make of him at first. Conscientious objectors were rare in combat units. Most COs chose alternative service: civilian public service camps, forestry work, mental hospital orderlies. The ones who joined the military usually got assigned to medical units far behind the lines. Thomas requested combat medic training. "You understand?" the assignment officer said. "Combat medics see more action than infantry sometimes. You'll be in every firefight, every attack. You just won't be able to shoot back." "I understand," Thomas said. "Most medics carry a sidearm for self-defense." "I won't." The officer stared at him. "You're either the bravest man I've met or the stupidest." "Maybe both," Thomas said. That stillness again, that clarity. The officer approved the transfer. Training was brutal. Not physically. Thomas was farm strong, could march 20 miles with a full pack, but psychologically. Combat medic school taught you to run toward gunfire, not away from it. They drilled it into you. When shooting starts, everyone hits the ground except medics. Medics stand up. Medics move forward. Medics identify themselves with Red Cross armbands that are supposed to protect them, but also make them perfect targets. Thomas excelled. He was calm under simulated fire. His hands didn't shake during triage exercises. He memorized field medicine protocols like Bible verses: stopping arterial bleeding, apply pressure, tourniquet above the wound, treating sucking chest wounds, occlusive dressing, 3 sides taped, managing shock, elevate legs, preserve warmth, reassure constantly. That last part, reassure constantly, came naturally. Thomas had a voice that calmed people, soft but certain. The instructors noticed. "Bennett," one said after a field exercise, "you've got the touch. Men will trust you out there." In November 1944, Private First Class Thomas Bennett shipped out with the 36th Infantry Division, bound for the Pacific Theater. He was 23 years old. He'd never thrown a punch, never fired a gun, never kissed a girl. He'd spent his whole life preparing to save lives in a war designed to end them. The contradiction didn't bother him. It was his purpose. The Philippine Islands in early 1945 were a graveyard pretending to be an archipelago. Thomas Bennett arrived at Lingayen Gulf on January 9th aboard a LST landing ship tank that pitched through black water under a blacked-out sky. The 36th Infantry Division, Texas National Guard, veterans of Italy, hard men with hard memories, had been chosen to help liberate Luzon from 3 years of Japanese occupation. General MacArthur wanted it done fast. The Japanese wanted it done never. The space between those two wants was where men like Thomas Bennett worked. He got his first look at war before he even reached the beach. The kamikaze hit their convoy at dawn, a Zero fighter with a 500-pound bomb screaming out of low clouds straight into the bridge of the escort carrier Amane Bay. The explosion turned morning into noon. Thomas, standing at the rail with his medical bag, watched men jump from the carrier's deck. their uniforms on fire, trailing smoke like falling stars. The ship listed, burned, and within hours slid beneath the waves. Destroyers picked up survivors. Thomas helped treat them when they were brought aboard his LST, third-degree burns covering 80% of their bodies, skin coming off in sheets, screaming for morphine, for mothers, for death. He used an entire morphine syrette on a sailor whose face was gone. The man died anyway, but died quiet. "First time?" a Navy corpsman asked, watching Thomas's hands shake afterward. "Yeah. Won't be the last. Welcome to the Pacific." The landing at Lingayen was unopposed. The Japanese had learned from previous invasions. Don't defend the beach, defend the interior. Let the Americans come ashore, then bleed them in the mountains. It was a sound strategy. It meant the 36th Infantry spent the next month pushing inland through terrain designed by God to kill soldiers. Razor-edged kunai grass, 8 feet tall, mountains that climbed at 45-degree angles, jungle so thick you couldn't see 10 yards. And everywhere the Japanese were waiting. They fought differently than Germans. Thomas heard that from the Italy veterans. Germans fought to win ground. Japanese fought to kill Americans, even if it cost them everything. They dug caves into mountainsides, reinforced them with logs and coral, positioned machine guns to cover every approach. They didn't retreat. They died in place. And they took as many Americans with them as possible. The 36th mission was to push northeast toward Baguio, the summer capital of the Philippines, nestled in the mountains of northern Luzon. Japanese General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, who had conquered Singapore, commanded 152,000 troops in the Luzon highlands. He was dug in. He was supplied. He wasn't leaving. Thomas Bennett's company, Company B, 1st Battalion, 142nd Infantry Regiment, walked into that meat grinder in early February. The days blurred together. March through jungle, take sniper fire, hit the ground, wait for artillery, advance again. The casualties came in a steady hemorrhage. Malaria, dysentery, heat stroke, sniper rounds, booby traps. The war here wasn't dramatic battles, it was attrition, a grinding accounting of bodies. Thomas moved through it like a ghost. While other men stayed low, he stood up. While others returned fire, he ran forward with his medical bag. The Red Cross brassard on his left arm marked him as a non-combatant under the Geneva Conventions. The Japanese snipers either didn't care or couldn't see it. They shot at him anyway. He saved his first life on February 4th. A private named McCulloch stepped on a Japanese grenade trap, a Type 97 hand grenade buried with its pin connected to a tripwire. The explosion took his right foot off below the ankle. He was screaming, arterial blood pumping into the mud, already in shock. The platoon was pinned down by machine gun fire from a position they couldn't locate. Nobody could reach McCulloch. Thomas reached him. He crawled 30 yards through ricocheting bullets, talking the whole time. "Hang on, Mac, I'm coming. Stay with me, buddy." Loud enough for McCulloch to hear over his own screaming. When he got there, he applied a tourniquet above the knee. The ankle was too destroyed. Packed the wound with sulfa powder, injected morphine, all while bullets kicked up dirt around them. Then he dragged McCulloch, one-handed, the other holding the tourniquet tight, back to the aid station. McCulloch lived. Lost the leg, but lived. "You're crazy," the company commander, Captain Reese, told Thomas afterward. "That was suicide." "No, sir," Thomas said, cleaning blood off his hands. "Suicide would be not trying." The other men started watching him differently after that. Soldiers are superstitious. They believe in luck, fate, signs. Here was a man who refused to carry a weapon, who ran toward gunfire, who survived when he shouldn't. Maybe God protected him. Maybe his faith was armor. Maybe he was blessed. Thomas didn't believe in magic. He believed in duty. But he let them believe what helped them sleep. By February 9th, Company B had been in continuous combat for 5 days. They'd advanced maybe 3 miles, every 100 yards paid for in blood. They'd lost 32 men killed or wounded. The survivors were exhausted, filthy, scared. They'd seen friends die, had written letters home they knew might be the last ones. War does that, makes you old in days. That morning they got orders to secure a rice paddy complex near the village of San Miguel, 6 miles south of Baguio. Intelligence said light resistance. Intelligence was wrong. The field was maybe 200 yards across, flooded rice paddies divided by narrow dikes, water ankle deep, reflecting gray sky. On the far side, a tree line, mahogany and bamboo, thick enough to hide an army. Between the American position and those trees, nothing. No cover, no concealment, just open ground. Company B's objective was simple: cross the field, clear the tree line, establish a perimeter. Standard infantry movement. Should take 20 minutes. It took 7 hours, and almost everyone died. The Japanese had turned the tree line into a fortress. At least 3 machine gun positions, Type 92 heavy machine guns, the same ones that had slaughtered Marines at Guadalcanal, positioned in interlocking fields of fire. Mortars pre-registered on the rice paddy approaches. Riflemen in spider holes along the dikes. They'd had weeks to prepare. They'd studied every angle. They knew exactly when to open fire. The first squad was halfway across when the machine guns opened up. The sound, Thomas would remember this for the rest of his short life, wasn't like the movies. Movie machine guns go rat-tat-tat. Real ones sound like canvas ripping, fast and continuous, a buzzsaw cutting meat. The 7.7mm rounds from the Type 92 traveled at 2,300 feet per second. At 200 yards, they punched through helmets, flak vests, bodies with equal ease. 7 men went down in the first burst. Just collapsed, like puppets with cut strings. The survivors hit the mud, screaming for covering fire, screaming for help, just screaming. The second squad tried to advance to support them. More machine gun fire, 3 more down. The company radio operator took a round through the throat and drowned in his own blood before anyone could reach him. Captain Reese, crouched behind a dike with Thomas and 30 terrified infantrymen, was screaming into the radio, "We need air support. We need artillery. We have men down in the open and we cannot reach them." The response crackled back. Negative on air support. Weather. Negative on artillery. Too close to friendly forces. Hold position and wait for flanking maneuver. "How long?" Reese shouted. 2 hours minimum. In 2 hours, every wounded man in that field would be dead. Already Thomas could hear them, Private Kowalski calling for his mother, Sergeant Davis trying to crawl backward with 2 broken legs, PFC Martinez sobbing that he couldn't feel his hands. Their voices carried across the water, mixing with the machine gun fire that started up again every time anyone moved. Thomas looked at Reese. "Sir." "No." Reese knew what he was going to say. "Absolutely not. That's suicide. You go out there, you're dead in 10 seconds. They'll be dead in less if I don't. That's not our problem right now. We can't lose you too." Thomas was already checking his medical bag. Morphine, 12 syrettes, bandages, sulfa powder, tourniquets, everything soaked with the sweat from his back. He slung the bag across his chest, tightened the straps. "Bennett, I'm ordering you to stay here." Thomas looked at him, that stillness, that clarity. "Sir, respectfully, you can order me not to carry a weapon. You can't order me not to save lives. That's not how this works." He stood up before Reese could respond. The machine guns found him immediately. Thomas heard the round snapping past, that particular crack of supersonic bullets breaking the sound barrier near your head, and his body wanted to drop, wanted to curl into the smallest possible target, wanted to live. He didn't drop. He ran forward, 75 yards to the first wounded man. Thomas covered it in perhaps 20 seconds, though time behaved strangely. Simultaneously too fast, don't think, just move, and too slow, every step a conscious decision to not die yet. Bullets hit the water around him, throwing up white fountains. One round clipped his helmet, spun it sideways on his head. He kept running. Private First Class Eddie Slovik Jr., no relation to the executed deserter from the European theater, but cursed with the same name, had taken machine gun rounds through both legs. He was conscious, screaming, trying to tie his own belt as a tourniquet, and failing because shock makes your hands stupid. Thomas slid into the water beside him. "I got you," Thomas said. His voice was calm, impossibly calm. He was pretty sure he was about to die, but his voice didn't know that. He worked fast. Tourniquets on both legs, above the wounds. Morphine pushed the syrette straight through Slovik's uniform pants into his thigh muscle. pressure bandages packed with sulfa powder. The whole time, bullets hitting the water, hitting the mud, hitting nothing and everything. The Japanese gunners were trying to zero in on him, adjusting fire. Thomas could almost feel them behind their sights, tracking him. "Can you crawl?" he asked Slovik. "No, legs, can't." "Okay, hold on to me." Thomas grabbed Slovik under the armpits and started dragging him backward. Slovik weighed maybe 160 pounds. His equipment, rifle, pack, ammunition, added another 60. Thomas weighed 145 pounds, soaking wet. It shouldn't have been possible. He did it anyway. The trip back took longer, much longer. Thomas couldn't run while dragging a man. He could only shuffle backward through calf-deep water, step by painful step, while machine gun fire chased them. Twice he slipped, fell into the water with Slovik on top of him. Twice he got back up. His shoulders screamed. His legs burned. His vision tunneled to just this. Move one foot, move the other foot. Don't stop. Don't think. Don't die yet. When he finally reached the dike where Company B was sheltering, hands reached out, pulled Slovik to safety. Someone was pounding Thomas on the back, saying something he couldn't hear over the ringing in his ears. Reese was there, face white. "I told you." "I know, sir." Thomas was already checking his medical bag, counting remaining supplies. "Who's next?" "What?" "Who else is hit out there?" Reese stared at him. "Bennett, you almost died." "Almost isn't dead." Thomas pointed across the field. "That's Private Kowalski. He's hit in the chest. I can hear him from here." "You are not going back out there." Thomas was already moving toward the edge of the dike. "That's an order." Thomas looked back, very quietly. "Court-martial me after I save him, sir." And he stood up and ran again. The second trip was harder because the Japanese gunners were ready for him. They'd marked his position. When Thomas came up over the dike, all 3 machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The air turned solid with lead. Thomas zigged, an infantryman's instinct, even though he wasn't infantry, and somehow the bullets missed. Not by much. Rounds hit so close to his boots that mud splattered his pants. But missed. Kowalski was 60 yards out, clutching his chest, blood bubbling from his lips. Sucking chest wound, one of the worst. Air being drawn into the chest cavity through the bullet hole, collapsing the lung. Kowalski would drown in his own blood in minutes if Thomas didn't seal that wound. Thomas reached him, dropped into the water beside him. "Breathe slow, Walter. Slow breaths, I got you." But Kowalski's eyes were panicking, the look of a man who can feel himself suffocating, who's fighting his own body. Thomas ripped open Kowalski's uniform, found the wound, entry hole above the left nipple, no exit wound, tore open a cellophane wrapper from a ration package, placed it over the hole, taped 3 sides to create a one-way valve. Immediate fix. Not perfect, but enough. "Now we run," Thomas said. "Can't." "Yes, you can." Thomas hauled Kowalski upright. The man was bigger than Slovik, heavier. Thomas didn't care. He got under Kowalski's shoulder, wrapped his arm around his waist, and half dragged, half carried him back. This time, a bullet found them. Thomas felt it hit, a tug at his side, sharp and hot. He thought, "That's it. That's the one that kills me." But his legs kept working. He didn't fall. The bullet had gone through the fabric of his uniform without touching skin, missed him by maybe half an inch. He got Kowalski back, handed him to the medics at the aid station, turned around. "Don't," Reese said. Wasn't even trying to order anymore. Just begging. "Please, you've done enough." "There's 6 more," Thomas said. He made the 3rd trip, and the 4th, and the 5th and 6th. Private Chen, leg shattered by mortar shrapnel. Thomas splinted it with a rifle he found in the mud, irony using a weapon to save a life, dragged Chen back. Sergeant Davis, both legs broken, spine possibly fractured. Thomas tied him to a stretcher fashioned from bamboo and shelter halves, pulled the whole contraption back while machine gun fire walked up the dike behind him. Lieutenant Murphy, unconscious, head wound, probably wouldn't make it, but Thomas tried anyway, got him back. Murphy died 20 minutes later, but died with a medic holding his hand instead of alone in the mud. Corporal Washington, gut shot, intestines visible. Thomas knew it was fatal, but went anyway. packed the wound, gave morphine, whispered lies about how Washington would be fine, and dragged him back so he could die near his friends. 6 trips, 6 men. 2.5 hours of continuous exposure to machine gun fire that never stopped, never slackened. The Japanese gunners must have thought he was invincible or insane. They kept shooting. They kept missing. By the 6th trip, Thomas's uniform was shredded. His helmet had 3 bullet creases. His medical bag was almost empty. 2 morphine syrettes left, handful of bandages, sulfa powder nearly gone. His hands were steady, but his body was shaking, running on adrenaline and faith and something beyond both. The men of Company B watched him like a miracle. Every time he emerged from that bullet storm alive, they cheered. They'd stop trying to stop him. You can't stop angels. You can't stop men who've decided they're already dead. "How are you still alive?" someone asked when Thomas returned from Trip 6. He didn't answer, didn't know. God, maybe. Luck, probably. Statistical impossibility made flesh. He looked back across the field. The machine gun fire had slackened. The Japanese gunners were probably reloading, repositioning. In that brief quiet, Thomas heard it. Someone calling for help. Faint. Far out. Private Eddie Slovik Jr. The man he'd saved first. Thomas had thought Slovik was secure in the aid station. He wasn't. In the chaos, wounded men had been moved around, and Slovik had been carried to a different position, closer to the tree line, waiting for evacuation. A mortar had hit near him. Now he was hurt again, worse than before, and calling for a medic. Calling for Thomas. "No," Reese said when Thomas stood up again, not ordering, pleading. "You've done 6. 6? That's impossible. Don't make it 7. Thomas checked his medical bag. 2 morphine syrettes, few bandages. It would have to be enough. "Someone has to," he said. "The bullet finds him on the 7th run. It happens 75 yards out, exactly halfway to where Eddie Slovik Jr. is screaming." Thomas is moving in a crouch now, not running because his legs are too tired, not crawling because that's too slow, just shuffling forward in a duck walk that makes him a perfect target. The machine gunner who shoots him is probably 19 years old, probably drafted, probably scared, probably has a family back in Japan waiting for him to come home. None of that matters. His job is to kill Americans. He's been trying to kill this particular American for 3 hours. Finally, he succeeds. The 7.7-meter round enters Thomas Bennett's abdomen just below his rib cage, slightly to the left. It tumbles through his liver, perforates his stomach, nicks his spinal column, and exits through his back. The wound is mortal. Thomas knows this immediately, not from pain. There's surprisingly little at first, just pressure and heat, but from the feel of it, the wrongness of it. Something essential has broken inside him. He goes down on his knees in the water. The machine gun swings back toward him for a second burst. The gunner is professional, knows wounded men crawl, knows you finish what you start. But Company B's .30 caliber machine gun team has finally gotten into position. They open fire on the Japanese gun emplacement, forcing the gunner to take cover. It buys Thomas maybe 30 seconds. He uses them. Morphine syrette, pulls one from his bag, bites off the seal, stabs it into his own thigh. The rush of warmth through his blood, the fading of pain, the false strength it gives. He has maybe 15 minutes before shock takes him. Needs to move. He crawls forward, not away from the Japanese guns, toward Eddie Slovik Jr. Every soldier in Company B is screaming at him to come back. Reese is on his feet, waving arms, yelling orders that Thomas can't hear anymore because his hearing is tunneling, narrowing to just the sound of his own breathing and the wet sound of his body dragging through mud. 50 yards to Slovik. Thomas covers it in 5 minutes that feel like 5 hours. His vision is graying at the edges. The blood loss is catastrophic. He's leaving a trail in the water behind him, red spreading across the rice paddy like ink. But his hands are still working. His mind is still clear. Morphine has given him that gift. He reaches Slovik. The private is worse than before. The mortar that hit near him has torn open his abdomen, the kind of wound that kills slowly, painfully, Slovik is conscious, which is unfortunate because consciousness means knowing you're dying. His eyes find Thomas's face. Bennett? His voice is weak. Thought you left me. Never, Thomas says, or tries to say. His voice isn't working right anymore. Comes out as a whisper. He pulls out his last morphine syrette, administers it to Slovik. Now they're both floating on pharmaceutical grace, both dying, both temporary. Thomas tries to drag Slovik. Can't. His body won't obey anymore. His arms pull, but nothing happens. The bullet through his spine has started to take effect, partial paralysis creeping through his lower body. He can't stand, can barely move. So he does the only thing left. He positions himself between Eddie Slovik Jr. and the Japanese machine gun nest, drapes his body across Slovik's torso, covering the worst of the wounds with his own flesh, creates a human shield. He's dying anyway. Might as well die useful. The machine gun fire starts again. The bullets hit Thomas Bennett in the back. One round, then two, then a third. He feels them as distant thuds, like someone knocking on a door very far away. His body jerks with each impact, but he doesn't move away from Slovik. Can't move. Won't move. He's still covering Slovik when Captain Reese leads a suicide charge across the rice paddy. 15 men running through machine gun fire because they can't watch their medic die alone. They reach the 2 men, throw smoke grenades for cover, and drag both back while pouring suppressive fire at the tree line. They get Bennett back to the aid station. He's still conscious, morphine and willpower keeping him aware. The battalion surgeon takes one look at the wounds and knows. Multiple penetrating injuries. Massive blood loss, spinal damage. Nothing to do but make him comfortable. Thomas Bennett dies at 13:47 hours on February 9, 1945. He's surrounded by the men he saved: Slovik, Kowalski, Chen, Davis, Washington. They're all there, all alive, because he ran toward death instead of away from it. They watch him go. Some cry, some pray. All remember. His last words, witnessed by Captain Reese and recorded in the company log, "Did I get them all?" "Yeah," Reese lies, because there's no point in truth now. "You got them all, Tom." Thomas Bennett closes his eyes. That stillness returns. That clarity. The same look he had in the baptismal font in Morgantown. The same certainty he carried through training, through war, through every impossible rescue. He looks at peace. He dies. 23 years, 2 months, and 2 days old. The Medal of Honor citation reads, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." CPL. Bennett was a medical corpsman serving with the 1st Battalion in its attack on a strongly defended enemy position. During the fierce engagement, several members of his unit were seriously wounded and unable to move from their exposed positions. Without regard for his own safety, Seapolar's Bennett left his position of cover and, completely disregarding intense enemy rifle and machine gun fire, ran across the open terrain 6 successive times to rescue 6 wounded comrades. On his 7th trip, he was mortally wounded. Despite his wounds, he managed to crawl to the last wounded man and administer first aid, then shielded him with his own body until help arrived. CPL. Bennett's extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty were in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself and the United States Army. The citation doesn't mention that Thomas Bennett refused to carry a weapon. Doesn't mention his conscientious objector status. Doesn't mention that he was a pacifist in the most violent conflict in human history. Those details weren't relevant to the Army. The heroism was enough, but those details are the entire story. Thomas Bennett didn't save those men in spite of being a conscientious objector. He saved them because he was one. His refusal to kill wasn't weakness. It was the source of his impossible courage. While other men were trained to take lives, Thomas was trained himself, really, to preserve them at all costs, including his own. The Medal of Honor was presented posthumously to Thomas's mother, Margaret Bennett, on December 8, 1945, in Morgantown, West Virginia. She accepted it in the same white church where Thomas was baptized. The ceremony was brief. Margaret didn't cry. People who knew her said she'd stopped crying weeks after the telegram came. What she said afterward was recorded by the local newspaper. Thomas believed that all life was sacred. He proved it. I wish he hadn't had to die to prove it, but I understand why he did. He was my son. I knew him. Private Eddie Slovik Jr. survived his wounds. Spent 2 years in military hospitals, underwent 17 surgeries, was medically discharged in 1947. He lived to be 83 years old, died in 2008 in his sleep, surrounded by children and grandchildren who exist only because Thomas Bennett crawled 75 yards through machine gun fire twice. In 2010, Slovik's daughter, a woman who never met Thomas Bennett, who wouldn't exist if Bennett had listened to orders and stayed behind cover, traveled to Arlington National Cemetery, where Bennett is buried. She placed flowers on his grave. The plaque identifies him simply: Thomas J. Bennett, Corporal, U.S. Army World War II Medal of Honor. She stood there for an hour. Other visitors to Arlington that day reported seeing her talking to the gravestone, though they couldn't hear what she said. Later, interviewed by a local news station, she said only, "I was thanking him and apologizing that it took me so long." The other men Bennett saved that day scattered across America after the war. They carried their wounds, some visible, some not, back to farms and factories and offices. They married, had children, built lives in the long peace that Thomas Bennett helped purchase but never saw. In 1985, 40 years after that rice paddy in Luzon, 5 of them gathered in Morgantown for a reunion. They were old men by then, 60s, 70s, carrying the weight of decades. They visited Bennett's childhood church, still standing, still white. The baptismal font was still there. They stood around it, these old soldiers, and tried to explain to the young pastor what it meant. "He came out of this water different," Walter Kowalski said. His voice was rough from decades of cigarettes and damaged lungs. "And because he was different, we got to grow old." The pastor asked if they wanted to say a prayer. They did. 5 old men who'd seen too much death, praying for a boy who died before he could see enough life. The irony wasn't lost on them. Here is what Thomas Bennett's faith cost. 1 life. His own. Age 23. Entire future erased. No marriage, no children, no chance to see the world he'd helped save. Here is what it bought. 6 lives that day. Eddie Slovik Jr., Walter Kowalski, David Chen, James Davis, William Washington, 1 unnamed lieutenant, plus all their descendants, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. By 2025, 80 years after Bennett's death, the number of living people who exist because he ran into machine gun fire 7 times exceeds 300. 300 lives purchased with 1. The mathematics seem straightforward. But they're not, because the real cost wasn't just Bennett's death. It was everything that made the death necessary. It was a world so broken that the only way to save lives was to offer your own. It was a war so total that even pacifists had to wade into its machinery. It was the fundamental tragedy of Bennett's story. He was a man who believed violence was wrong, forced to prove that belief in the most violent way possible. He never fired a shot, but he was shot 7 times. He never killed anyone. But the war killed him. He lived his principles absolutely, and his principles demanded he die. There's a philosophy question that professors love, the trolley problem. A runaway trolley is headed toward 5 people. You can pull a lever to divert it, but it will kill 1 person instead. Do you pull the lever? Most people say yes. 5 lives matter more than 1. The math works. Thomas Bennett lived the trolley problem in reverse. He was the 1 person who put himself on the tracks so 5 others, 6 others, 7 others could live. But he didn't see it as a trolley problem. He saw it as Tuesday. Just another day of doing what his conscience demanded. That's the part that haunts. Not the heroism. Heroism is comprehensible, even if it's rare. What haunts is the ordinariness of it for him. The calm in his voice when he said, "Who's next?" The matter-of-fact way he checked his medical supplies between trips across a killing field. The stillness. Most people, when they imagine themselves in Bennett's position, imagine the fear, the adrenaline, the dramatic choice. But Bennett didn't choose heroism on that rice paddy. He'd chosen it years earlier in a church in West Virginia when he decided that "thou shalt not kill" meant something real. February 9, 1945 wasn't the moment of choice. It was just the moment when the bill came due. The question that remains 75 yards through machine gun fire. Thomas Bennett covered that distance 12 times in one day. That's 900 yards total, just over half a mile. Men have walked farther to get coffee, but distance isn't measured in yards alone. It's measured in what you cross, what you endure, what you risk. By that accounting, Thomas Bennett traveled farther in 3 hours than most people travel in a lifetime. The question his story poses, the question that made his fellow soldiers watch him in awe, that made his commanders shake their heads, that makes us remember him 80 years later, is this: how? How do you run toward death? Not once, in a moment of panicked heroism, but 7 times. How do you stand up when every instinct screams to stay down? How do you keep going when your body is failing, when bullets are hitting all around you, when the smart thing, the sane thing, the survivable thing is to stop? The answer for Thomas Bennett was simple. You decide what you believe. And then you believe it all the way to the end. He believed human life was sacred, all human life, including the enemy's, which is why he wouldn't carry a weapon. But also including his friends' lives, which is why he couldn't stay behind cover while they died. His faith wasn't selective, it was absolute. And absolutism, when faced with war's compromises, creates martyrs. But here's what's easy to miss. Thomas Bennett didn't see himself as a martyr. Martyrs are people who die for belief. Bennett was just a man doing his job. His job was saving lives. The danger was incidental. The heroism was accidental. The faith was everything. In the end, that's what makes his story unbearable and essential. He didn't want to be a hero. He wanted to be a medic. He wanted the war to end. He wanted to go home to Morgantown, maybe marry a girl from church, work an ordinary job, live an ordinary life. He wanted what everyone wanted, to survive. He just wanted something else more. He wanted his conscience clean. And in the calculus of Thomas Bennett's soul, living with blood on his hands was worse than dying with none. So when the machine gun found him on the 7th run, when the bullet punched through his abdomen and he knew he was dying, there's no evidence he regretted anything. The witnesses say he looked peaceful. That stillness again. That clarity. He'd kept his faith. He'd saved his friends. He'd proven that you could walk through hell without becoming hellish, that you could fight a war without becoming warlike, that you could die violently while living nonviolently. The contradiction killed him, but the conviction sustained him all the way to the end, all 75 yards, 7 times.